Okay, imagine a world. A pretty vibrant, globalized world, actually. You've got powerful empires, complex trade routes, huge cities. Sounds a little familiar, right? Now, imagine all of it, just vanishing in less than a single lifetime. Today, we're diving into one of history's greatest cold cases, the Great Collapse of 1200 BCE.
And that quote right there, that's the question that just hangs over this whole story. We're talking about an advanced, literate, interconnected society that just disappeared, plunged into a dark age that lasted for centuries. It's a seriously chilling story from the past, and it's exactly why we need to figure out what went so horribly wrong.
So let's treat this like a proper investigation. We need to examine the crime scene. Before we can understand the collapse, we first have to get a feel for the world that was lost. I mean, what did this thriving Bronze Age civilization actually look like right before it basically fell off a cliff?
Look, this was a seriously advanced international system. You had the legendary Mycenaean Greeks, the guys from the Trojan War stories. You had the mighty Hittite Empire and what's now Turkey. And of course, Egypt's powerful New Kingdom. And these guys weren't living in bubbles. No way. They were all linked up by these super sophisticated trade networks, shipping everything from bronze to olive oil across the sea. The whole thing was managed by literate bureaucrats. It was a complex, efficient, and globalized world.
And then, it all just stopped. The end was brutally fast and unbelievably total. All across the Eastern Mediterranean, these great capital cities, these centers of trade and culture, they were violently destroyed. Burned to the ground, many of them never to be lived in again.
And with those cities and palaces gone, something even more shocking happened. The actual knowledge of writing just vanished in huge parts of this world. For centuries. I mean, can you even imagine an entire society just forgetting how to read and write? That's how deep the collapse was. And that economic engine they had built, it just seized up. The trade networks that were the lifeblood of their world completely evaporated. The ships stopped sailing, the flow of goods ended. The whole system just ground to a halt. In about 50 years, one person's lifetime, this entire vibrant world was just gone.
So, the big question is, what could possibly cause a failure that catastrophic? For decades, historians have been trying to solve this, and they've rounded up a lineup of the usual suspects. And honestly, any one of them could have been a civilization killer on its own.
So for a long time, public enemy number one was a mysterious group of invaders from the sea. Egyptian records call them the Sea Peoples. Others pointed the finger at Mother Nature, evidence of a monster drought that lasted for centuries. Then you have the theory of an earthquake storm. Yeah, that's a thing, a whole series of massive quakes that just hammered the region for decades. And of course, with all that chaos, you've got the strong possibility of an inside job. Widespread rebellions from people who were starving and desperate.
So for years, the debate was kind of, which one was it? The invaders, the drought, the earthquakes? Everyone had their favorite culprit. But thanks to modern archaeology and climate science, we've had a breakthrough. And it turns out this wasn't a simple murder mystery with a single killer. The real story is way more complex.
When you actually look at all the evidence together, a different picture starts to emerge. We have paleoclimate data, stuff like ancient pollen, that confirms a devastating 300-year-long drought hit right at this time. That means widespread famine. Then archaeologists dig up the burned cities, which confirms the violence was real. And we even have texts from Egypt describing their fight against these mysterious sea peoples. You see? No single piece of evidence explains everything. Instead, it looks like a whole bunch of crises were all happening at the exact same time.
So, the verdict is in. It wasn't one killer, it was more like a conspiracy of circumstances. The collapse wasn't caused by a single event, but by a domino effect, a cascade of failures in a system that had become too rigid and too interconnected to handle the shock.
There's a name for this. It's called systemic collapse. The best analogy is probably a modern power grid. You know how one failing substation can trigger a blackout across an entire country? That's basically what happened here. These Bronze Age civilizations were so tightly linked, so dependent on each other, that a failure in one part of the system brought the whole thing crashing down. They had no backup plan, no redundancy.
It was a total perfect storm. So here's how the dominoes fell. First, the drought hits, which leads to massive food shortages. That widespread famine creates desperation. People start moving. Those sea peoples were probably climate refugees, and you get internal rebellions. Then, while all this chaos is unfolding, these earthquake storms start leveling what's left of their critical cities and ports. Their whole economic model, which was this very centralized system controlled by the palaces, it just couldn't handle all these shocks at once. It shattered. Each disaster just made the next one worse until the whole thing came apart.
And right here, this is where a 3,000-year-old story suddenly becomes a really urgent warning for us. Because when you start to look at the vulnerabilities of their world, it begins to feel a lot like you're staring into a mirror.
I mean, the parallels are genuinely unsettling. They had these interconnected palace economies. We have globalized financial markets. They were completely dependent on reliable shipments of bronze to make their tools and weapons. We depend on just-in-time supply chains for, well, everything. Their system had very little flexibility, very little redundancy, and ours is built on hyperconnectivity. Their version of globalization created a hidden fragility that they couldn't see, not until it was way too late.
And you want to know maybe the most chilling lesson of all? The societies that actually made it through the collapse, like Egypt, which barely hung on, and inland Assyria, they were the ones who were less connected to this whole international system. In their world, at that specific moment of crisis, being isolated was actually a survival advantage. Think about that for a second.
Which leaves us with one last really big question. We have built the most complex, interconnected, and efficient global system in all of human history. We celebrate it, we're proud of it, but looking back at the ashes of the Bronze Age, you really have to ask yourself, does all this connection ultimately make us stronger, or have we just built a more sophisticated, more elaborate, and much more fragile system that's just waiting for the right combination of shocks to fall?